well-known example of revolution in Latin America, and that was the Cuban Revolution, which featured the rise of Fidel Castro and the installation of a revolutionary socialist regime which has lasted into the 21st century. But in a lot of ways, the Cuban Revolution was also a logical expansion of some of the revolutionary goals shared across Latin America in the 20th century. For instance, it was intended to give power to the people. Now, it also resulted in a dictatorship. But the aims of the revolution were not all that different than the aims of, say, the Mexican Revolution or the Bolivian Revolution or even Arben's Guatemalan election, which was a sort of political revolution in 1954. The idea was to return political power to the people and defeat a dictatorship. The idea was to nationalize industries which foreign companies had taken over. The idea was to return land to the peasants, and of course, the idea was also to improve conditions for the urban working classes. These are the sorts of things that we've been talking about ever since Latin Americans turned against the ideas of order and progress in the late 19th century. Cuba is a particularly interesting and paradigmatic example, and actually, it's a little bit of a surprise. Cuba was not one of the most unequal places, it was not one of the poorest countries in Latin America, I should say, but it was maybe one of the most unequal countries. While there was a large middle class in Cuba, there was also a large, brutally exploited working and peasant class in Latin America. Further, one of the conditions complicating Cuba was the just inestimable corruption which had existed in that country ever since its independence. Remember that when Cuba gained its independence at the end of the 1800s, the United States immediately became involved and directed the development of Cuba's economy and political system. They even, as we've seen, exported ideas of racism, which were digested in Cuba and made it into some official practices. The simple matter of the fact is that many Cubans saw that Cuba, from its very beginning of its independence from Spain in the end of the 1800s, was a puppet state subservient to foreign interest from its very beginning. Most people considered that Cuban politics were irredeemably corrupt, and nobody represented that corruption better than the general who had been either in charge, had served as president, or was operating behind the scenes since the 1930s, General Fulgencio Batista, who, when he overthrew the government, was supported by the United States. Now, Fulgencio Batista, who had been operating behind the scenes for decades, in 1952 nakedly overthrew the democratically elected government of Cuba. He did this in 1952. In 1952, Cuba had no economic or political crisis. So when Fulgencio Batista overthrew the government and installed himself as dictator, this was seen as a seizure of power, which was a naked act of aggression and self-interest on the part of the general. Batista, as a result, was intensely unpopular. Making him even more unpopular were the practices that he carried out. He repressed the population. He censored the media. He closed the universities. He arrested people arbitrarily, and many were assassinated. And in fact, most people recognize that Batista was an instrument of the United States. Batista had become the United States' pawn in thwarting land reform in Cuba and other attempts to reform Cuba politically, economically, and socially. He had operated from the behind the scenes in the 1930s and the 1940s, even serving one presidential term from 1940 to 1944. But it was in 1952 that Batista declared himself a dictator and took over. Now, this was seen as particularly corrupt, and Batista was understood to be merely a pawn of the United States. What was the United States' involvement in Cuba? Well, most importantly, the United States bought the majority of Cuba's sugar. Like most other Latin American countries, as we have seen, there was one crop which they produced for worldwide consumption and upon which their economy depended. And in the case of Cuba, it was still sugar, right? And with the United States buying that sugar, that meant that the economy of Cuba was dependent in no small part upon sugar. Peasant farmers were pushed off their land as sugar cultivators increased their holdings. As they were pushed off their land, they went from being self-sufficient farmers who could grow enough food to take care of themselves to becoming wage workers on the large sugar estates. If this sounds familiar to what was happening in Morelos, Mexico, and the sort of antipathy which Zapata took advantage of in declaring revolution against the Mexican government of Porfirio Diaz, it should sound familiar because it's very similar to what was happening. Many of these people who lost their land were then forced to go work, if they wanted to survive, they wanted to feed themselves, had to go work on the large sugar plantation for wages. The wages were not very high, but even more problematic is that sugar does not require year-round cultivation. So these farmers who lost their land and then went to work on the large sugar estates in Cuba, for about 4 months a year, they would be employed, and the rest of the year they had to scramble to make ends meet. Working on the sugar plantations was not consistent work. And unfortunately, by the 1950s, rural workers numbered about 600,000 out of 5 million, and they lived lives that were desperately poor, unable to make their ends meet because of the inconsistent demand for their labor on the sugar plantations, and of course the low wages which were paid to them. Unemployed sugar workers had always been an important political factor in Cuba, and in fact there was a 1933 uprising where the reformist Grau San Martin took over, and they were the ones who backed him up. But he did not rule for very long, as Batista returned to power shortly thereafter. In any case, by the time of Batista's seizure of power in 1952, about 75% of Cuba's arable land, meaning land that could be farmed, was actually owned by foreigners. So the fact is that the rural poor in Cuba were desperate. This is a ripe situation for revolution, as we've seen throughout Latin America, mirroring very much the more explosive causes of the Mexican Revolution. In addition, however, Cuba was also severely fragmented between classes and races. The landowners and rural proletariat in the countryside posed a stark class division, and there was a racial division as well. Steady Spanish immigration had whitened Cuba in the 20th century, but nevertheless, Cuba still had a 25% black or mulatto ethnicity. And of course, those who were descended from slaves were still the poorest people on the islands, right? So Cuba still had a racism problem. And we've already seen when Cuba adopted an idea of national identity that transcended race, this forestalled any opportunities that black folks or the descendants of the enslaved would have to organize politically. And as we've already seen, there had been quite a bit of racial conflict in Cuba following its independence from Spain. The race war of the Oriente in 1912, and of course the brutal oppression of the Partido Independiente de Color, which was a party formed specifically to address the grievances of the descendants of slaves in Cuba, which was brutally repressed in the early 20th century. Now, one of the things that Fidel Castro would promise to do when he came to power would be to ameliorate, or rather improve, Cuba by getting rid of the lingering effects of racism, right? So racism, classism are still problems. Another problem in Cuba is, of course, as I've already mentioned, that the rural proletariat was being pushed off their lands and pushed into wage work, which was inconsistent and compensated very poorly. Enter into this equation Fidel Castro. Slide number 6, the rise of Fidel Castro. Now, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with Fulgencio Batista, who took over the government in 1952. Many middle-class people were upset, and remember, this is similar to what we saw in both Argentina and Mexico. The middle class had been frozen out of the political process, and at least the initial stages of revolution in those two countries were initiated by middle class people who wanted more access to political power. In the case of Mexico Revolution, the political scope that began the revolution then expanded significantly to broaden its aim to address many other concerns as well. But Cuba had very much a similar problem in that the dictatorship was seen as illegitimate and produced a lot of dissent on the part of the Cuban people. So enter Fidel Castro, a former lawyer, a frustrated baseball player who had wanted to try out for the United States baseball teams, but had never actually been successfully or drafted. So Cadet Castro, upon returning to Cuba, took advantage of this widening distrust of the Fulgencio Batista government and this illegitimacy of the Fulgencio Batista dictatorship, and alongside 165 followers, Castro made an attack on the Moncada barracks in Havana on July 16, 1953. Why would he initiate this suicidal attack on the Moncada barracks? Right? Castro should have known that they would never be able to be successful. Oh, and apologies, I misspoke. The Moncada barracks were not actually located in Havana, they were located in Santiago de Cuba. In any case, this attack on the Moncada barracks on July 26, 1953 was seen by most as suicidal. This barracks was a base for 1,000 army troops, and Castro, when he attacked the barracks, only had about 165 followers. Now, why would he make such a suicidal frontal attack on the institutions of power in Cuba? He thought that by attacking the barracks, it would initiate shockwaves throughout the country and lead to a massive revolt. It did not. In fact, the attack failed miserably. Half of the assailants were killed, and the other half were captured and put into prison. From prison, Castro wrote perhaps his most famous early speech, History Will Absolve Me, where he defended his attack on the Moncada barracks, and he languished in jail for some time. But then, in 1955, Batista, who was aware of the growing discontent against his regime, especially amongst middle-class people, decided that an act of amnesty would perhaps improve his reputation amongst his greatest detractors. And what he did to sort of try to improve his reputation was to release a great number of political dissidents from the prison, because of course Batista had for years rounded up anybody who criticized his regime and put them into prison. Of course, Castro, who led an attack on the Moncada barracks, which nakedly assaulted the institutions of power, was also put into prison. But in a show of amnesty and to court the favor of political moderates and the middle class, Batista granted an amnesty to the prisoners in 1955 and released them, including Castro. Now, what did Castro do with his newly won freedom? He fled to Mexico, and he began organizing the Movimiento de 26 de Julio, the movement, M26-7 movement. July 26th was the day that they attacked the Moncada barracks, and this is why the movement was named that. Now he goes to Mexico, and this time the plan was another grand ambition. Castro was going to launch another attack on Cuba and capture the entire city of Santiago, which was Cuba's second largest, but not by himself. He was working with urban revolutionaries who would coordinate a revolution from within. So this was the plan. The working class would ally with Castro and his groups. The working class would strike and begin their revolution in Santiago de Cuba. As Batista's forces were busy battering down the uprising, Fidel Castro and his men would land outside of Santiago de Cuba, join the uprising, and ultimately put so much stress on the Batista regime that it would fall. But this time, unlike the attack on the Moncada barracks, Castro did prepare for the possibility of defeat in case the plan did not work out. While in Mexico organizing the M26-7 movement, Castro called on the services of a veteran of the Spanish Civil War to begin training men in the tactics of guerrilla warfare, just in case they were scattered outside of Santiago de Cuba and their initial attack failed. Good planning on his part. Now here's a definition that we should probably have as guerrilla warfare. These are little wars waged against the government that intend to put so much pressure upon the government that ultimately it falls, right? Guerrilla warriors are very difficult to defeat because they blend in with the countryside, they know the environment better than their attackers, and they have the support of the people. Now this was not plan A for Castro, but it was plan B. In order to join this potential uprising, which was planned for 1956, Castro left Mexico City in an old barge named the Grandma from the port of Tuxpan on November 26th of 1956. It left in the middle of a terrible raging storm. And here's how one of the participants remembered the journey of the Grandma as it made its way across from Mexico over to Cuba. Quote, "We began a frenzied search for the anti-seasickness pills, which we did not find. We sang the Cuban national anthem and the hymn of the 26th of July for perhaps 5 minutes, and then the entire boat took on an aspect both ridiculous and tragic. Men with anguished faces, holding their stomachs, some of them with their heads in buckets, others lying in the strangest positions, immobile." Who said this? A young man named Ernesto, or Che, Guevara, who was a doctor from Argentina who had dreams of joining revolutionary movements to liberate the people and had come to Mexico City precisely to join Castro's movement to overthrow the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Henceforth, Che Guevara would play a very important part in the revolution to overthrow Batista in Cuba. Now, as the boat made its way over to Cuba to coordinate their attack with that of the people who were rising up in Santiago de Cuba, the insurgents in that city, they rose up in rebellion and they took control of the city for a few hours. Unfortunately, Castro's men landed in the wrong place, and they were quickly discovered by army units and scattered into the mountains nearby. So they had never been able to join the uprising in Santiago de Cuba because Batista's men scattered them before they could ever reach that city. Of the 82 men who landed in the wrong spot, only about 15 were able to regroup and make their way into the Sierra Maestra mountains nearby. The rest were killed, captured, or scattered. And as one historian has said, Thomas Wright, quote, "Out of desperation, rather than choice, then, was born the rural guerrilla warfare."